46 years ago, Bryan Jennings kidnapped a little girl from her own bedroom and murdered her in cold blood. Governor Ron DeSantis recently signed his death warrant and he is scheduled to be executed on November 13. On the night of May 10, 1979, Bryan Jennings, on a brief leave from his Marine duties, headed out to meet his friends at a local bar. Later that evening, he made his way to the home of Rebecca Kunesh, quietly lingering by her house and peering through her bedroom window while she slept. After drinking with his friends at one bar and then moving on to a second, Jennings eventually returned to the Kunesh residence, the night's dark intentions still shadowing his steps. In the early morning hours of May 11, 1979, Rebecca Kunesh was asleep in her bedroom, a nightlight casting a soft glow, while her parents slept elsewhere in the house. Jennings approached her window, saw her asleep, and removed the screen before climbing into her room. He covered her mouth, took her to his car, and drove to a secluded area near the Girard Street Canal on Merritt Island. There, he essayed her, causing severe bruising and lacerations to her private area, using such force that he injured his own private parts. During the assault, he lifted her by her legs, carried her over her head, and swung her to the ground, fracturing her skull and causing extensive brain damage. While she was still alive, Jennings forced her into the canal and held her head under water until she drowned. Jennings was 20 years old. Rebecca was only 6. Not long after, the little girl's body was found. Later that same day, Jennings was taken into custody for a traffic violation in Orange County, Florida. As the investigation progressed, law enforcement linked him to Rebecca's murder and formally arrested him on that charge. Although Jennings initially denied any involvement in the crime, he eventually admitted to the police that he had killed her. Jennings faced charges including first-degree murder, kidnapping, essay, and additional offenses related to Rebecca Kunesh's death. The prosecution made it clear they intended to seek the death penalty. In June 1979, a circuit court judge allowed the taped confession of Jennings to be admitted as evidence, concluding that he had given it voluntarily and not under any form of duress. His trial began in February 1980 before a jury in Brevard County. During this trial, the recorded confession was played for the jury, and the former cellmate testified that Jennings had openly boasted about killing Kunesh. Fingerprint analysis further linked him to the crime, as experts confirmed that his prints were found on Kunesh's bedroom window, demonstrating he had broken in and carried out the abduction. A psychiatrist also provided testimony, stating that Jennings was not mentally ill or legally insane, but he did display a predatory personality and a deeply disturbed moral compass. On February 7, 1980, Jennings was convicted of first-degree murder, kidnapping, burglary, and sexual battery. 4 days later, on February 11, 1980, the jury recommended that he receive the death penalty with a majority vote of 11-1. Then, on May 7, 1980, Circuit Court Judge Tom Waddell formally sentenced Jennings to death and additionally handed down 4 life sentences for the other charges. On April 8, 1982, the Florida Supreme Court granted Bryan Jennings' appeal and ordered that he receive a new trial due to procedural errors that had occurred during his original trial. The retrial was conducted in July 1982 before an entirely new jury. Rebecca Kunesh's parents attended the proceedings as witnesses, and it was reported that the retrial reopened their emotional wounds, forcing them to relieve the pain and grief of losing their daughter. On July 15, 1982, the jury once again returned verdicts finding Jennings guilty on the original charges, which included first-degree murder, kidnapping, sexual battery, and burglary, although he was acquitted of 1 count of sexual battery. Shortly after this conviction, Jennings' attorneys announced that they planned to file an appeal on his behalf. The following day, July 16, 1982, the jury recommended that Jennings receive the death penalty for the murder of Kunesh with a majority vote of 9-3 in favor of execution. Before he was formally sentenced, Jennings requested to be classified as a mentally disordered sex offender, hoping this designation would allow him access to psychiatric treatment, but the trial judge denied his request. On September 3, 1982, Circuit Court Judge Clarence Johnson officially imposed the death sentence on Jennings for the charge of first-degree murder. In addition to the death penalty, the judge handed down 3 consecutive life sentences for the remaining convictions, which included kidnapping, sexual battery, and burglary. Finally, on July 12, 1984, the Florida Supreme Court denied Jennings' second appeal, upholding the convictions and sentences handed down in the retrial. In May 1985, the Florida Supreme Court reviewed Bryan Jennings' third appeal and granted it once again, ordering a second retrial on the basis that his first retrial had involved procedural errors. Before this second retrial could take place, Jennings' attorneys attempted to have certain evidence suppressed, arguing that it had been obtained illegally. Jennings went on trial for the third time on March 24, 1986. To reduce publicity and ensure a fairer, more impartial proceeding, the trial was moved from Brevard County to Bay County. On the same day, a jury was selected to hear the case. By that time, Kunesh's parents had divorced, yet they continued to grapple with the devastating loss of their youngest daughter, a loss that Kunesh's father described as an unending nightmare. On March 28, 1986, the jury once again found Jennings guilty of the original charges, including the murder of Rebecca Kunesh. During the trial, Kunesh's father reportedly urged the jurors to impose the death penalty. During the hearings, two psychiatrists testified about Jennings' mental state, noting some signs of improvement, but also emphasizing that he remained self-destructive and had a high likelihood of committing sexual offenses again. One psychiatrist indicated that while the murder itself might not have been premeditated, the abduction and essay were clearly planned, and that Jennings had the ability to distinguish right from wrong. On April 8, 1986, the jury recommended the death penalty for Jennings by a majority vote of 11-1. Subsequently, on April 25, 1986, Circuit Court Judge Charles Harris formally sentenced Jennings to death for first-degree murder, marking the third time he received a death sentence. In addition, Jennings was given 3 consecutive life sentences for the remaining charges of sexual battery, burglary, and kidnapping. On August 27, 1987, the Florida Supreme Court dismissed Bryan Jennings' fourth appeal challenging his murder conviction and death sentence. Several years later, on June 13, 1991, the Florida Supreme Court denied another appeal filed by Jennings. On March 20, 1998, Circuit Judge Geer Lober rejected Jennings' motion seeking a new trial. 2 years later, on March 22, 2001, the Florida Supreme Court turned down Jennings' sixth appeal. On September 29, 2005, U.S. District Judge Robert Hinkle dismissed Jennings' federal appeal. On July 3, 2007, his appeal to the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals was denied. Subsequently, on March 31, 2008, the U.S. Supreme Court dismissed Jennings' final appeal, upholding his death sentence. Guys, the reason I'm mentioning all of these appeals in my videos is to show you just how many chances the death row inmates have, and this explains why most of them spend decades on death row. On October 4, 2018, Jennings filed another appeal to the Florida Supreme Court seeking a review of his death sentence in light of the 2016 U.S. Supreme Court decision in Hurst v. Florida and the related Florida Supreme Court ruling. Both decisions had established that only a jury could determine a death sentence and that the sentence must be based on a unanimous jury vote, while Jennings' sentence had been decided by an 11-1 vote. However, this appeal was rejected because his sentence had been imposed prior to June 2002 and the new laws were not retroactive. In addition, the requirement for unanimous jury decisions was later changed, with Florida Governor Ron DeSantis signing legislation allowing death sentences to be imposed with the agreement of at least 8 jurors. Finally, on July 22, 2024, the 11th Circuit Court of Appeals denied Jennings' most recent appeal. Following his initial sentencing in 1980, Bryan Jennings was placed on death row at the Florida State Prison. He was originally set to be executed by electric chair on October 27, 1989, after then-Governor Bob Martinez signed his death warrant in September of that year. However, on the day before his scheduled execution, October 26, 1989, the Florida Supreme Court granted Jennings a stay, postponing the carrying out of his sentence. On October 10, 2025, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis signed a new death warrant for Jennings, scheduling his execution for November 13 this year. Following the issuance of this warrant, Jennings' attorneys began preparing appeals to both the Florida Supreme Court and the U.S. Supreme Court in an effort to delay or prevent his execution. It remains to be seen if the execution will be carried out. Please hit that subscribe button if you like my channel. See you next time. Bye-bye.